All right, today we are talking about working with databases. Today we'll be talking about bringing data into Excel from databases. We'll see several different ways, including VBA, to do that. And then next time we get together, we will talk about actually modifying, using VBA to modify databases, relational databases. So we do have like one file that we'll want to access from the course blog. But let's go ahead and do a little overview of relational database management. So the relational database management system. So it turns out that we finally got a standard way to manage data. Was introduced in 1970. There's an IBM employee named Edward Codd, who said, you know what, we should have a way to organize data that the logical structure of the data is totally separate from the physical implementation of the data. And that was a new idea in the 1970s. And that was really the birth of relational database management systems. And that's the way that we manage data probably up until, that's the way that everyone managed all their data in any serious endeavor up until about the year 2000, right? Early 2000s. Even when you look at, kind of large systems that are kind of, web scale, like Google and such, we're using relational database technology up until the very, very late 90s, when they were starting to push the boundaries of what that technology was capable of doing. And so really beginning slowly in the early 2000s and then moving forward, we have other options besides relational today, but relational database management is still the foundation of where your corporate database is going to be stored and how it's going to be accessed. So it's all about the data. The relational database management system is kind of there to protect the data. In fact, there's going to be a piece of software that we're going to be working with today called a database engine. You've got a database engine, and that is non-visual software. You never ever see the database engine. And anytime you're working with a relational database management system, there's always an engine that's separate from the front end. We'll see the front end here in just a second. But the engine then is what's responsible for managing the data, for handling data security, integrity, recovery, definition, data manipulation. I mean, the nice thing about this software, it's fairly expensive software, but this software is, it's there to protect that data. When you put the data into a well-configured relational database management system, it's safe. If there is, some kind of catastrophe, someone pulls the power cord out of the wall right while you're in the middle of updating something really complex, not a problem. You can recover from that. Anyway, that's the engine that we'll be working with. Now, here, let's, we got to get a little experience with the user here. So a little clip for the user. I've got to get to 2 minutes and 47 seconds. This is from Star Trek, what is it? Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home. What did I say, 247? Perhaps the professor could use your computer and my volume all the way up. I think that's all the volume I'm going to get. It's not it's not showing anywhere. It's actually showing on Zoom. Stand by. So was it showing a minute ago? Yeah, it was. Master display volume. There's one more place I can control the volume. That might get us a little more. Here's Scotty. They're back to the 1980s to bring back some whales to the future. Have you seen this movie? You know Scotty. Okay. I think this is great. The fact that Montgomery Scott is like intimately familiar with Mac OS 9 is amazing. And that he can do all that by typing. Anyway. So So you've got the engine, which is non-visual software. You then have front-end software. That's going to be software that is used for user interaction. So you've got some user, anything the user is interacting with in a database management system, that's what we call as the front-end software. And they are totally separate pieces of software. Have you used Microsoft Access? Anyone here use Microsoft Access? Yeah, so in that case, it feels a whole lot like you're just installing one piece of software, but there really is a separate non-visual database engine that's running that you're working with when you're using Access. And it actually, I think they've recently changed the name. It used to be called the JET engine, J-E-T. JET was an acronym that stood for Joint Engine Technology, which I think is like the best example of figuring out a cool acronym and then thinking, what could we possibly make that would go with this? It's not any ordinary database engine. This is a JET engine. So the point is then that you've got front-end software that is responsible for displaying the data, formatting the data, aligning it, sometimes sorting it. Some sorting happens by the engine. But basically, any interaction with the user then happens with the front end, is the front end application. And so the way that these work together is we say, all right, you got the front end software that is responsible to interact with the user. You've got the database engine that's responsible for handling everything about the data. And so we're going to have some kind of request that goes from the front end system over to the engine. That engine will then either do what the request asked for, like it may be that it's asking for data to come back out of the engine, and in which case it'll send the data back if it can, or if it tries to do whatever it was asked to do, but it fails for some reason, like you're trying to put data that's not allowed to go in, or the way you ask the question is malformed, then the engine will send back a response that's an error message. And so the main thing that we're going to see here then is we'll be using today's structured query language. If you say, you know what, I've done something with structured query language in the past, raise your hand. I just want to see where you are. Looks like about half, maybe a little more than half of the class. It is the standard language that we use for interacting with relational database management systems. And in fact, even very many non-relational database management systems have made languages that are very, very similar to structured query language to be able to interact with the data that's in the engine. Okay. So that's the high level view of what we're going to do. Oh, yeah, there's one more slide transition here. And that is, we're going to be using now Microsoft Excel as a front end to Microsoft SQL Server. And so that's what we're off to do. So that's kind of high level of what we're about to accomplish here inside of Excel. Any questions? I'm going to open up a brand new blank workbook. And the very first thing we're going to do, I think, will work on Mac. But that'll be like the only thing that works on Mac. This stuff that we're doing today is pretty much dependent on the Windows operating system. So let me first show you an add-in. So if we come to Insert, then there should be something like Get Add-ins or Microsoft Store or something. Are you able to access that on your computers? Yeah, in the back. Oh, you're giving me the thumbs up. Thank you. I'm going to type in query here. And we're going to use this second one, the Atlas Query Processor. I'm going to add this. Continue. Once you add that, it should show up on your home. This little icon show up on your home menu. It's easy to take off. If you want to get rid of it after this example today, insert my add-ins. Just below where you got it, here's where you can manage your add-ins. And then you can just remove it here. So this is actually an add-in that I wrote to be able to help myself get data that I wanted to be able to work with. There were 3 database management systems I was working with at the time that I wrote this heavily. One was Microsoft SQL Server. We'll use that functionality today. One was Airtable. Any of you used Airtable here? No, some of you will have a little bit. and then data.world. And maybe you have a little more experience with data.world. So this add-in will connect onto those data sources, and we'll pull data off of them, and actually we'll let you push data results up to data.world if you're interested in doing that. I'm just going to click access my data now, and it turns out that the default query here, that's kind of the example query, is actually running against SQL Server. So the default here is SQL Server, but it's just a server that I maintain in the web. So it's not especially interesting, but you can see that when we make a request, maybe instead of customer, I'll change this to employee. And instead of putting it on a customer's table, I'll just leave that blank. And so you can see that there's a little delay as it brings the data back, because it's making a request off to a SQL Server that's out there somewhere online, and it's bringing the data then back here into Excel. So I'm going to set that aside for just a second and follow that link that we have from the blog today. This is code that we're going to need to bring into VBA to do the kind of connection that we're doing here. But what I want to do is come down here to, let's see, back off just a bit, to look at this connection string. Maybe I'll scroll this over just a bit more. Because this has the information that we need. So there's like 4 pieces of information that you got to have to be able to connect onto like a corporate database like Microsoft SQL Server. One is going to be the server, like the host name for the server. One is going to be the database you want to talk to. Then you're going to need to have a username and a password. So I'm going to just drop down this little chevron here. And instead of the demo connection, I'm going to use the Microsoft SQL Server connection. And I'm going to kind of plug these things in here. So the username is redcatuser. Password is case sensitive, so I'm going to copy that. The server is colonialbakehouse.com. This is the default port for Microsoft SQL Server. If I say, how many of you could say, you know what, you could tell me something about what a port is used for in internet protocols? Okay, let me just take a brief moment on that. So when you have a host name, first of all, anytime you've got a host name like google.com, byu.edu, in this case, colonialbakehouse.com, that is always going to get, that's the way that humans think of hosts, or the way that humans think of a particular computer on the internet. Let me just pull up a tool here. Let me pull up PowerShell. And so if I was to run the network command ping, and this command ping actually is a metaphor for like being in a submarine. You want to know what's out there. You use your sonar to send out a sound, ping, and you listen for what comes back. I'm just going to ping google.com. And it's going to answer back and basically say, I'm here. So I'm communicating with the server. But the thing that I'm pointing out here is that the way that routers see servers is not by their domain name. The very first thing that has to happen anytime I'm saying I've got a domain name I want to work with is that my computer has to convert the domain name into an IP address, because the IP address is what can get routed on the internet. You're going to go from router to router to router to ultimately to find the system I'm trying to talk to. And so when we say a host name gets converted into an IP address, and that allows me to talk to a particular machine. The port, so yeah, this is the IP address of google.com. If you were to do this example, several of you would get a different IP address, because of course it's not just one computer that's running all of Google. And so when you ask for which computer I'm talking to, when I talk to google.com, you'll get different values here. But that computer, or any given computer, can be doing multiple different kinds of things. It could be running a web server. It could be running an email server. It could be running a database server, we'll be talking about. It could be running a file, FTP, like a file server. It could be running lots of different services. And so knowing the machine I want to talk to is not enough. I have to know the machine and the port. So a particular given machine listens for traffic on specific ports. And so when I want to talk to like byu.edu, and let's see, we'll just go ahead and go there. Okay, so this is HTTPS. So that means that the S there means that the traffic between the browser and the server is encrypted. It's the protocol. But because it's HTTPS, I know that this is actually listening on port I think it's 443. So I'm going to come after the host name and put a colon 443, and I'm going to tell it that's the port that I want to talk to this server on. And it's going to say, yeah, I'll give you that information. Let me go ahead and put the dot or colon 443 back in there. Okay, so if I'm here on this Google page and I paste in that with the port 443, you'll see that it routes to that okay. Because the web server is listening on that port. But if I tell it some different port, say 444, then the web server at byu.edu is not listening for traffic on port 444. So I am trying to communicate with that server. I've got the right server, but I'm talking to it on the wrong, kind of almost think of it as like a little, once I've gotten to the right building, I got to get to the right office, or I've got to get to the right, kind of telephone line to pick up and say, hey, I'm ready to talk to you. And I'm trying to talk on 444 right now. No one's listening on 444. Right? That server is listening on 443. And so that's what the port is. You don't ever think about a port when you're working with the browser because everyone uses the standard ports, which is port 80 for non-encrypted traffic and port 443 for encrypted traffic. And so your browser actually will, if you don't put the port in, it will go, oh, I'll look at the protocol and say, I know which port you really want to talk to this server on. And there are some places that run servers on different ports, to kind of do different things. Like for development, that's really common. Okay, so what that means is that the default port that Microsoft SQL Server listens on is 1433. And so that's what the port is. Anytime you're talking to an internet server anywhere, it always takes a host name and a port to be able to make the communication. The vast majority of times we're running on the default ports, and so we don't ever think about the port. And the database for this one is called Red Cat. I don't know if it's case sensitive, but lowercase will work. And I'll change this from employee to product. And that should now bring in information from the product table. So it's making a connection onto a particular server. I've provided my credentials, told it the database I want to get data out of, and then it brings the information. Yes?
This can work with like any type of database?
So when you say this, you mean this add-in?
Yeah.
This add-in only works with 3. It works with Microsoft SQL Server, airtable.com, and data.world. But there are tools built in here that are kind of more general. So if I come to the data tab and come to get data, from database, I have not tried to pull data in this way for a while. But here's SQL Server database, and then there's like lots of other options here from a MySQL database, DB2, Postgres, Sybase, Oracle. Just try this really quickly. Don't do this along with me until I see that it works. I don't think we need any advanced options. I'm going to use connects to the database, not through Windows credentials, but database credentials provided to the database. Red Cat user. And let's see if we can connect. Unable to connect to the data source, encrypted connection, trying to unencrypted connection. Not quite sure what I have to do to make an unencrypted connection, or maybe it was trying it automatically. Okay. So do you want to try this one along? This is going to be Windows only. Do you want to try this one along with me? Yeah, let's do this one because this one's a pretty powerful connection. I'm going to go, I think I'm done kind of showing this Atlas query tool here. Okay, so on the data tab, I'm going to choose get data from database and then from SQL Server. So it'll want to know the server to talk to, which is colonialbakehouse.com. And the database is redcat, R-E-D-C-A-T. Wonder what's under advanced options. We'll say okay. Now it remembers what I put in. So next, you've got to put your credentials in. The default place is like trying to use a Windows account to authenticate. And we don't, that server that we're talking to out on the web doesn't know anything about your Windows user. So you've got to make the second option there, which is use the database credentials. So we're on the left, it says Windows at the top, and then it says database underneath. And what's the third part? What's the third one say? Microsoft account. Yeah. So you are going to be using that second one, the database account. And that's where you're going to put in the username, which is redcat_user, and the password, which is capital T Thomas, like the name THOMAS _1775. And then what does the button say? Connect. Yeah. Then click connect. And it should take a moment because it's really loading quite a bit of data. Oh, let's see. Has it worked for anyone? Yeah, it worked for one? Raise your hand if it worked for you. Interesting. So the thing is, I'm not, what network are you, what wireless network are you connected on? Like, are you using EduRoam? Yeah. You're on EduRoam? Okay, so wireless, so one of the things that we do with wireless networks is we say, look, people are coming up here, we don't even know who they are, they're kind of walking up next to our building and getting access. One of the things that we'll restrict is we'll say, what ports will we route traffic? You're making a request on port 1433. That router can decide, you know what, I'm just not going to route that request. You know, maybe I'll route 443, encrypted web traffic, unencrypted web traffic, port 80, maybe a few others. But it sounds like we are actually kind of routing 1433 traffic. That's good to know. Now, if you're not getting connected, what are you getting an error message? Yeah, it could be a bad that would be a bad password, would give you that error.
I got confused because on the left there were those three options that you were saying, but on the first option, that is the one that it opens up to, and then right in front of you it's like two options, and they're very similar to what the
right. Yeah. It's like the username and a password here.
So it was like use database credentials, and so I typed that in, but I was under the Windows.
Right.
And it didn't work, and then I went to the middle one. Type the same thing in.
Yeah, so make sure you're making the choice on the left that says database. What does it say? Database? It says database.
Database.
Microsoft account is the third one. Yeah. Okay. If this works for you, great. If not, it's not the end of the world. You know, we'll see it work here, and we'll move on to examples that will work for you. Okay.
I have a question about SQL Server.
Yes, go ahead.
Is that like a thing that generally, like a lot of databases use?
So the question is SQL Server something that a lot of databases use? And the answer is no. SQL Server is the name of a relational database management system that's made by Microsoft. So, you know, who are the big players in relational database management? The biggest one is Oracle. And so Oracle it's the name of the company and it's the name of their product, their flagship product, which is software meant to manage relational database. The second biggest player there is either IBM or Microsoft, depending on how you count. If it's Microsoft's product is SQL Server, the one we're using here, IBM's is called DB2. There was never a DB1. They just started off with DB2, and that's what they called it. In terms of, and these are like market share in terms of dollars spent on relational database management, not like in terms of amount of data managed. The other really popular databases there's two open source ones. One is actually maintained by Oracle called MySQL. Have you heard of it? So that's open source. So that's free to use. I mean, you have to have hardware to host it and such, but the software is free to use. And then the other open source one that's really popular for, especially for web stuff, is called Postgres. But these are all relational database management systems that they all do the same thing. They manage data using the relational model, which means we're storing data in tables. We're using primary keys and foreign keys to link data from different tables together logically so that we can kind of ask any question. That was the really big thing about relational database management, is that if you could imagine that maybe we're running some kind of a billing system for a hospital, kind of before the days of relational database management. And we could have had, and we've got all the information about the procedures that have been done, kind of when they paid for them, when the procedure was done, what doctors did it, when they paid for them, and so forth. And then we could have a manager say, do we have, and we're kind of, aging collectibles, like we're trying to get all this money collected in. And we can ask a question today that says, do certain procedures lead to longer collection times? So, are there some kinds of procedures that we have a harder time getting paid for? And that's a question that if we hadn't anticipated that question when we were writing the system to begin with, all the information could be in the system and there would be no way to ask that question. What relational database management systems did was it said, look, you put the data in here and then you can ask any question you want about it. You don't have to know the question that you were going to ask before you started design. If the data's in there, you can, on an ad hoc basis, say, I want to look at the data now this way and connect up all these things and say, that's the question I want to ask. And that was the big advance that relational database management gave us. Okay, so over here, I can now, I can just, let's see, maybe I'll just choose the manufacturer table. Here it is, kind of previewing that data. And I'll just click load and it should bring in that information, hopefully. And so now it has actually built that as, it's actually a query, meaning that if this data were to update, and this data set doesn't update, this is a static data set that I have posted out there. But if it were to update, I could right click this and choose to have a refresh here, refresh, and that will send the request to that and bring in the data exactly the way it is right now. So that's using the kind of the built-in tool for doing that, but that's going to be limited to, on a Mac, even try to do that. What happens if you go to the data tab? Is there anything about bringing data in from external data? Any of our Mac users? There are probably some options there, but the last time I looked at it, which was probably more than a year ago, they were pretty limited in terms of what you could do. Okay, so in this point, now we're saying, all right, somewhere out there in the cloud is a Microsoft SQL Server instance, and we've given everything we need to connect to it. That is the host name, the port, the database, the username, and the password. Once we supply those things, said, yeah, that's it. We'll let you talk with this server back and forth. So we're using Excel as the front end, connecting up to that Microsoft SQL Server backend. The backend has all control over the data. And as long as we formulate our request right, we can get it to give us data to be able to be displayed here in Excel. Okay, questions? Let's go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Find open like a Power Query editor.
Yeah, so this is kind of like the very front door of working with a set of tools called the data model, as well as Power Query. And we're not going to cover those in this class. And I don't know them well enough to even tell you how to back out of that or how you might have gotten there. But it would probably be okay if you wanted to just open up a new workbook to work on the next part of this example. Okay. But now what we want to do is we want to work with this through VBA. That's the point here, is we want to be able to connect on and pull this data in from VBA. So let's go ahead and open up our VBA editor, and we'll insert a new module. Okay, now here's where I'm going to need that block of code that we had from the blog at the beginning. So I'm going to paste that block of code in here, right below option explicit. If yours says option explicit, if it doesn't say option explicit, that's okay. And once we get that code in, we're going to take a look at this code, but there's a couple things that we're going to do first. Now, you get it by now. In VBA, we work with objects, methods, and properties, right? We live and breathe objects in VBA. The vast majority, if not all, in one instance, we've created an object from scratch. We use objects all the time. There's a worksheet out there, that's an object. There's a range out there. We want to change the background color of the range. We're going to just identify the object that's there. It's already there. We're going to use a particular set of properties and or methods to be able to get to modify that object the way we want to modify it. When we made a collection, one time we made a collection where we said, oh, we're going to make a brand new collection. And we actually had to make the new collection to be able to work with. And we've created other objects, like we've created sheets. You don't create ranges, but we create sheets and we can create workbooks. But all of those, the collection, the worksheet, and the workbook, those are ones that Excel all knows about natively. That Excel says, oh yeah, this is just something that we work with all the time, and so it's always available. What we're about to do is we're about to work with the tools for working with an external database. And when they're writing the VBA language, they said, you know what, these objects, this is not something everyone's going to do all the time. And so we're not going to build this in as a part of the object environment, the already built object environment that's a part of Excel. And so step one here to use these is to say we've got to go include the library. We have to make a reference to the library that knows how these objects are defined. And so that's what this first little note is here. We have to make a reference to the ADO-DB library. This stands for Active Data Objects Database. So someone, presumably at Microsoft, wrote a set of objects that says, hey, we know how to communicate with various database servers. You just configure it. Once you get these objects instantiated, you configure these objects and they can do all the heavy lifting of communicating across the internet with these servers. So what we're going to do is we're going to go add a reference so we have access to those objects. So I'm going to choose Tools and then References. Then I got to find the Microsoft Activex Data Access Objects Library. Okay, so all these that you see here are other objects that you have the ability to manipulate through VBA. So it might just be interesting to look at a couple of these. I'm not sure what all is installed on this, but there's something called the Acrobat Distiller, Acrobat Access. So this Adobe Acrobat stuff, that's something that I could automate through VBA. If the objects are available here, they're here because they're ones that I could, say, oh, I want to make an instance of that object and work the properties and methods to do whatever that one does. What else do we see that's interesting on here? So some other Adobe things, Illustrator, InDesign, Photoshop. I'm not sure what I would do with the Adobe Photoshop objects through VBA, but presumably I could use it to automatically manipulate some images, and I just don't know what it has access to, but Adobe has expressly said, we want to make this functionality available from inside of, they may not actually have said VBA, but they're saying the way that Microsoft automates things using the component object model. And that's the way that VBA does. So we have access to all of this stuff. What else do we have here that might be interesting? I'm not really recognizing anything else on the way here, but there's a lot. Here we are, the Microsoft Activex Data Objects Library, and there's many for me to choose from. 2.0, 2.1, 2.5, 6, 7, 8. 6.1 is the most recent one that I have here. The truth is, I think what we're doing here today, we could go with any of these even older versions, but I'm going to go ahead and choose the most recent version that I have available on my machine. Now, you want to make sure that you're not using the Activex data object record set, but the Activex data object library. And one little trick here is that clicking this line to make it blue is not enough. You actually have to check the box. So make sure that box has a check mark on it and say OK. So now what we've done is we've said, all right, now when this workbook opens, it's going to say, all right, we have to get the connection to that set of objects. A bunch of objects are built-in part of Excel. This is not one of them. And so if we want to use it, we have to say, expressly go out there and connect up to the definition of those objects for us to be able to use them. Okay. So there's two objects that are a part of that active data objects database object library that we are going to be using. One of them is called the connection object, and one is called the record set object. And so we've got kind of two steps that we have to do here. One is we have to configure everything that we need to know to be able to connect onto the database is going to be manipulating the connection object. And then once we've successfully got the connection object configured so that it can talk to that remote server, then we will use that connection object to be able to request data. And the data will come back to us using the record set object. You see it? We've got a connection that maintains our connection to the database, and then a record set object that allows us to pull sets of data, sets of records back from the server. We've got a couple of string variables here that will just help us get connected up to, help us configure our connection object. And so CS stands for connection string. So if we're going to actually make a string that has all the information we need to configure the connection, and then SQL will be the query that we're going to be running to ask for the data. And so I think I've got this connection string configured correctly for us. So we've got to tell it, hey, what driver are we using? We're going to be talking to SQL Server. If we're talking to MySQL or Postgres or Oracle, this kind of says which of the drivers we're using. I don't think I can show the drivers here anymore on this machine. Let me just try real quick. ODBC. Oh yeah. So if I hit Windows and type ODBC, the Windows key and type ODBC, see if I can do it right here. Yeah, ODBC stands for Open Database Connectivity. Oh, I've got 32 bits and 64-bit ones. Can I see the 64-bit ones? Yeah. And so this is just going to show me what databases this computer knows how to talk to. So by default, every Windows computer knows how to talk to SQL Server because when you load Windows, Microsoft puts the database drivers in for SQL Server. That's why we're using SQL Server, is because we don't have to worry about getting your machine configured to know how to talk to it. If it's Windows, it knows how to talk to it. But if I was to click here, choose add, oh, there's not many. So here there are two possible drivers that I could use. Now you may have other choices here. But if I wanted to be able to have my computer talk directly to an Oracle computer, then I would have to go through a process to install the Oracle driver on this machine, and then that would show up in this list. And that would be one that I could choose, one that I could configure VBA then to use to connect to an external database. So this part here, this driver is saying, all right, the machine has to be configured to talk to that kind of database, and SQL Server is the default. And so that's what the driver says. The database then is which database on the server, and we saw where we were specifying Redcat before for that. The server then is it's the host name that will evaluate to the IP address. It's a particular computer that's out there in the cloud somewhere. Question?
So the database Redcat, that's not owned by Microsoft.
So Redcat is not owned by Microsoft. That's right. So The idea is that Microsoft created SQL Server, and in SQL Server, they said, listen, as you're organizing your data, you might want to have databases that are separate from each other. So you might say, all right, I've got a database here that I'm dealing with, all of my sales data goes in this one database. And it's completely separate on the same Microsoft SQL Server instance, but it can be a completely separate database than that I'm using for some other particular kind of project. And so all those are names. That's how the server has been configured to be able to manage the data. So you need to know someone who knows about the database at your company to know what's the name of the database that you're connecting to.
And so like say you're at your company and you know the name of the database that you're trying to connect to, you can just use SQL Server to get to it kind of regardless of what that database is.
No, it would have, so the question is, so let's say we've got a database running at my company, and it's kind of over here. Can I just use SQL Server to get at it? And the answer is no. I would use the SQL Server driver if the database is being managed by Microsoft SQL Server, which is the software, one of the main softwares that runs relational database management. So if my company is using Oracle to manage the data, SQL Server is not involved in this at all. So I would have to get the Oracle driver installed on my machine, and then I could use the Oracle driver to communicate with the Oracle server. Other questions? By the way, folks, the reason that you want to be able to do this yourself, as not a data professional, as not the guy who's managing the data, this is how it works. If you say, you know what, I need some data, for some project that I'm working on. So it's going to take you a couple of days and probably several emails to even find out where the data is located. And then it'll be like, I need someone to do a custom query for me to pull this data. And so you finally, after a couple of days, you finally got the email address of the person who's going to help you get that data. And so you send the request to that person and say, listen, this is the data that I need. When can we talk about it? And what's that person going to do the first time you send that email? He's going to ignore it. Yeah. And he or she is going to ignore it. Why? Because it's a hassle and it's not normal part of the workflow. And if you're serious, you'll email again. So after a couple of days, he hasn't responded. He or she hasn't responded. You're going to email again. And this time he goes, okay, I guess you're serious. And they'll set up an appointment. And finally, you'll get an appointment to talk about what you want. And you'll say, yeah, this is what I need, the data that I need. And he'll say, great, totally got it. He's not really paying that close of attention because he thinks he knows. And so maybe a day later, you're going to get the data. And guess what? Yeah, it's not the right data. It's not even the data you asked for. And so you'll get a hold of him again, but you know what? Now he's at some training today, and so you can get a hold of him tomorrow. And you talk to him and say, listen, this was close, but what I really need is this. And now that he's gotten it wrong one time, he's really listening because he realizes he doesn't really know what you're after. And so he's listening, and now he's going to actually send you the data that you asked for. And when you get the data that you asked for, what are you going to realize? Yeah, what I asked for isn't everything I needed. And so I've got to go back. And this is going to take, if you're lucky, this will happen in less than 2 weeks. And so the real power of doing what I'm trying to teach you to do here is to say, listen, it's a little more difficult to convince that guy to give you the information you need to connect onto the database, but they certainly can give you permissions to have like read-only access to just the data that you need. And then you can write the query and immediately know, oh yeah, that's not right. Change the query, write it again, change the query, write it again. So instead of there being a 2 or 3 day lag time between you saying, this is the data that I need, and getting the data, you can change it down to just a few seconds. Okay. So that is going to get me connected to that particular database. Now, I'm going to, that's just a string. CS is just a string, it's a string variable. Now I'm going to use that connection string, CS, to open with the open method of my connection object. So remember, the connection object is the one that knows how to talk to a relational database management server. And so I'm saying, listen, you're going to use the SQL Server driver. It needs this information to be configured. And now we're going to give it the username and password. So here's username and password that we're using here. It should give you then authority. And it should, once you authenticate with those, that relational database management server says, listen, there's things you can do. You might not be surprised to learn that if you try to use these credentials to update the data in that database, it's going to say no. The Red Cat user does not have permissions to update. It's read-only access. And so that's also kind of a big part of what relational database management systems do, is that they have very tight control over who's allowed to have access, what kind of access to what data. Okay. And so, in fact, I'm going to comment out these last two. I'm just going to get connected. And I'm not going to open the record set, so I'm not going to try to close the record set, but I am going to close the connection. So if I can run this code and it runs without giving me an error and not like waiting for a long time, right? You can see that when I hit the run button up here at the top, it'll say running. It should say running. It's probably happening so fast now that you don't see it run. But if it says running up there, then there's some problem with the connection. But now I can go, I'm running this, there's no error, so I'm connecting onto that database. So now my SQL is structured, it's short for a structured query language. It is just a string variable. And so I'm going to put in here in text the string that I would like to, the query that I would like to use to say, hey, this is the data that I want. And this class, I think the book actually has a pretty good primer on structured query language. So if you're going, wow, I don't know anything about structured query language, the book can get you going on that. Here, I'm just saying I want all columns from the particular table. And once we get this back, I don't think I have to specify Red Cat because that's just the name of the database. I think because I'm connecting using that database here, I think that I can just not include this. But after we get the data, we'll play with that and see it. So now I've opened the connection using my connection string, my username and password. Now I'm going to call the open method of my record set object. So RS is defined here. It is that record set object. It's what knows how to bring back. It actually knows how to refer to a set of records, and it only actually brings back one record at a time. So I ask for the record, it brings back the next record I'm asking for. And the reason it doesn't bring the whole data set is that these data sets can be huge, way too big to fit into memory on your computer. And so it'll maintain your connection to the record set. You'll ask for a record, it'll give you the next record and kind of keep track of where you are going through that set. So I'm calling the open method of that, and I'm saying I'm going to use SQL. That's the data I'm asking for. Give me all the records and all the columns from the customer data set. And I'm using this connection, this connection here that is bound onto that instance of SQL Server. I'll run that again, and if we have no error here, invalid object name, customer, that looks pretty good. Let me try it without the Red Cat. Okay, so I don't want to say redcat.customer on front of that. I just want to say customer. I've got this database in 3 or 4 different places with slightly different configurations on the web. And so this one has a kind of a different configuration. So we're using the Red Cat database. We don't specify that name in front of it. Okay, so again, running now without error. That's good, but we're still not seeing the data. So let me go ahead and put a breakpoint right here. I'll just type it in as stop. So between where I'm opening the record set and where I'm closing the record set. Okay, so now I'm connected up to the server and I'm paused here. In fact, how many of you are actually doing this along with me? Okay, it's not everyone. I think we'll probably be okay. So it turns out that what we're doing right now, we're opening a connection and we're holding that connection open while we think and talk and discuss. You don't really do that in the world of database management. You open the connection, you pull your data out, you close the connection. Because maintaining that connection open on the server is consuming resources. And so if we were to have 100 students in class today, all with a connection open to that database, I don't think that this database server would be happy with that. I think it would probably would be dropping connections. And so even though what we're doing right now, we've got the connection open and we're just leaving it open while we talk. That's not what you really do when you actually do this, right? Open the connection, get your data, close the connection so that you don't abuse the server. Okay, so now I'm just going to come here and I'm going to print rs dot. Now there is a collection of my record set object called fields. It's a collection. And so I can refer to this either by number. This is a zero-based collection. So this is the very first field should be 0. And then I can ask for the name or I can ask for the value of that. So I'm saying, what's the name of the first field, of the number 0 field? And that's called customer ID. Now I can ask for the value of that. And it's telling me that the first record in this record set has a value of 12 for the customer ID. So a record set has access to one record at a time. But, and it was called customer ID. So of course we can refer to this by its name as well. You'll see that's 12 there. So I'm asking it for the name of the column, not just the number of the column. But it has a method, this object has a method called move next. Move to the next record. I'll execute that move next, and now I'll ask for the value of my customer ID, and it's customer number 17. So it's the next customer in the data. So my record set gives me access to any of the columns. So there's probably a first name and a last name. I'd be surprised if we don't have a phone number. So I can ask, while I'm looking at that one record, my record set gives me access to one record at a time, but I can ask for any column that I want off of that. Questions? Let's suppose that we want to just write on, let's do this. Let's go ahead and make a new sheet to receive the results of this query that we're running. So I'm going to go ahead and finish running this out, which will close my connection gracefully to the server. And let me go ahead here and we'll create we'll dim S as a worksheet. Set S equal to worksheets.add. And so now what I'd like to do right there across row number 1, I would like to just put the names of all the columns of this table. Whatever set of data has come back here. So let me just dim X as an integer. And now we'll do a loop for X equals 0 to rs record set dot fields dot count -1. It's a zero-based collection, so I'm going to go from 0 to 1 less than the count. So I should be able to print now rs.fields sub x.name. I'll just go ahead and run that. I'll stop at my breakpoint, but you'll see that that has printed into my immediate window all of the columns from the customer table. Well, I don't want to put them there. I want to put them on my sheet. So s.cells, row number 1, column number x plus 1, because x is going to start at 0, dot value is equal to the name. In fact, I'm not going to debug.print it. I'm just going to write it out to my sheet. I'll drag my current statement indicator back to the top of that loop and run that. And that should give me my data. Then my column name is written right across the top here. So I'm ready to bring the data in. I've written the names of the columns onto row number 1. Questions? Are we ready to move on, or are some of you saying here, I'm just getting caught up, we're not quite there? Like we're ready to go? Okay. So now I'm going to do a do loop. Do loop. Anytime I do a do and loop without putting an exit clause on there, I absolutely want to put a do events in here, so I don't accidentally run this and put myself into an endless loop. Maybe not a bad time to save. Come over here and save my work. Call this db read fall 21, and make sure it's an XLSM. Okay, so I am going to do, I want to now print off the values. So I am going to need something to keep track of which row I'm on. So let me declare another variable, dim_r as a long integer. Just before my do loop starts, I'll set r equal to 2. Now I'm going to just run this same loop that printed off my headers. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to read through across that whole collection of fields, but instead of printing the name, I'm going to print the value. So I'm changing name to value on the inside of this loop. And instead of writing at column 1, I'm going to write at column number r. I'm sorry, instead of writing at row number 1, I'm going to write at row number r. So I want to make sure that I'm incrementing r inside my loop. And I want to make sure I tell my record set to go to the next record. So when I open up the record set, I will be sitting on the first record. I'm going to write a loop here that run a loop here that says put all the names in row 1, and then we're going to write all of the values for every row that we're going to do. So we're already on the first row, so I've got a loop that writes out the values. 2 this time will be row number 2 to start with. We'll move to the next record. We'll indicate that we want to, remember we're on another row in the worksheet, and then we'll do that again. Now it turns out we want to do until rs.eof. EOF is a property of the record set. It stands for end of file. End of file is false until we try to read past the last record. So if I ask right now rs.eof, that's false. And so each time I read a row, it gets me the new data and goes, yep, we're still false. We haven't changed, don't need to change. But as soon as I read that last row, that behaves the same way. As soon as I try to read the next row after the last row, it goes, oh, there's no data here, and it's going to set EOF to true, end of file. We're at the end of the file. Be better in my mind if it was EOT, end of table, but this terminology came around before relational database technology came around. And so we're working with data in files rather than in tables. Okay, and so now we should continue to move to the next record set and move to the next row to write the data out until we've read past the end of the file. I'm not sure this will work having declared that R in there before, but I'm come up to where I set R equal to 2, and I'm going to run. And it looks like that did okay. Hit my breakpoint again, and I've kind of read that data now record by record and put it in here. I think there's what, 4,000 rows or so? Yeah, 4,400 rows. Question?
Could you just have made R equal to 1, and then it would have just put in the top part of the top, or the very first row
Oh, so this loop right here?
Yeah, like get rid of that. And then just make R equal to 1.
Ah, well, the difference here is that when I'm going through the first time, I'm writing out the name. This is the column name. And then I'm writing out the value here. So I certainly could have used R here, said R equal to 1, used R here, and then incremented R above the loop instead of below, or above this loop instead of below it. And I think that would have been a fine way to do it. But I do have to run through that first record set twice, once to get the names, and then once to get the values. And after that, based on the way I'm displaying the data, I don't have to worry about the names anymore. They're on row 1, and that's enough. Questions? Yes?
When you say the next record set, is that just the next row?
Yeah, it's not the next record set. My record set is the object that knows how to go row at a time. So when I say move next, it's going to the next row in the record set. And so, yeah, so that inner loop is writing out, it's writing this data out one at a time, right? So that loop writes across this, we say move next, the record set, then pulls in the next record from the database, and then we write out the values for that one. We say move next, and the record set moves to the next row. Our loop tells us to go back and write out all the values off of that one. Questions? All right, I'm going to finish running this out and then get rid of my breakpoint. And now what I'd like to do, I think I would also kind of like to make this into a table. I can never remember the full syntax for making a table, so I'm going to record it. So I'm going to hit the record button. Oh, by the way, I probably never showed this to you before. As soon as you make your developer tab visible, you always have a record button right down here, bottom left-hand corner. You don't even have to go to the developer tab. So I'll click on that. Macro 1 is fine. I'm just trying to find out what the code is so I can kind of integrate it to my existing procedure. I'll say OK, and then I'm just going to go insert and then click on the table, the third button over here, insert table and accept the defaults. And does that adjust the width too? It does, doesn't it? Yeah. Mostly, I think. I'll stop recording and go take a look at module 2. Okay, so the sheet is adding a list object, selecting it. So I think I don't, my guess is I don't have to name it. So I'm going to come back. It's not too bad. So after I put that data in, maybe after I've closed the connections, closed my connection and closed my record set, I'll go ahead and make that into an Excel table. So s.listObjects, S is the name of my worksheet that I've added. s.listObjects.add. I'm not doing anything with the return value, so I'll take off the parentheses. So it's going to be, source is going to be Excel, is where the data is coming from. The range, I think I'm just going to say it's going to be A1 dot current region. Remember, current region is the set of contiguous data from the cell that I'm starting on. Truth is, I don't know what XLES is doing here, but we could probably find out. This is, should it guess at whether there's headers or not? So has headers, we'll just change that to has XL guess, yes. Oh, it's either XL guess or it's yes or no. Anyway, yes, it has headers. That's what it says, it has headers. All right, well, I'll just change this now. So instead of asking for the customers, where's my query? Instead of select star from customer, I'll do select star from manufacturer. Manufacturer. I should be able to run that and get a new sheet now with my manufacturer data on it. Questions? Go back to that last line that we wrote. There are two more things, just really quickly. Let's go ahead and put a restriction on this. Let's say I'm only interested in the manufacturers who are in Massachusetts. So I could come here to my select clause and just put or my select statement, put a where clause. Where, and what is it? Where state is equal to, and then I'll use single quotes to identify a string literal in SQL, which is handy since we use double quotes in VBA. So notice here that inside my double quotes is where I'm putting the query, but I use single quotes in structured query language to identify a string literal. Just a different, I use different characters there. So now if I run this, it should give me another sheet, but it should only show my manufacturers from a particular state. So you've got kind of the full power of structured query language. Of course, VBA is not interpreting the structured query language, just holding it here and sending it off to the database management system to evaluate. And that's how we figure out which records we're going to get back. All right, I want to show one more thing. In fact, it's going to be a modification of what we have here. I want this one here just the way it is. So I'm going to copy DB1. And I'm going to name this one DB2. So maybe I'll take, yeah, I'll just leave this as manufacturer. I'll take the state clause off. This process here of going through this record set one row at a time and writing to the cells one cell at a time is going to take a while. Now here, even when we had like 4,000 records that came back from the customer database or the customer table, it might have taken a second, maybe 2 seconds to run. But we may very well bring in data that is tens of thousands of records or even hundreds of thousands of records. And doing this one cell at a time like this is going to probably take a couple of minutes for it to be able to run through that data to bring it all in. Well, it turns out that the good folks at Microsoft have anticipated this. So instead of writing a loop to do this, I'm going to refer to a particular cell, and I think I want to refer to A2. I've got my header. I'm still putting my header in on A1, starting on A1. But after that, I'm going to refer to s.range A2. And that range property has a method called copy from record set. And then it needs to know a record set object. Well, a record set object is RS. I think that's right. And so now if I run this, it should do the same thing, but it will do it substantially faster on large sets of data. Let's see how long it takes to bring in everything from the sale table, or actually the sale item table, I think is the biggest one in this database. So select star from sale item. Just know what sale item is. Maybe there's no underscore. So that ran in less than a second and brought back how many records? 12,000 records. I'm going to run that same query where we're hitting it cell by cell. Let's do this. I'm going to print the time beginning and the end. Still running. Still running. Finished. So that for 12,000 records, it wasn't terribly long. But it was 6 seconds to do it, compared to virtually instantaneously when we told it to just copy from record set. So if you're putting the data into cells in Excel, you should use copy from record set. The thing is wired to be able to pull data into a range from a record set. But that's only one thing that you might do with it, right? You might actually just look through the data through code to find what you're looking for and never ever display it to a particular worksheet. Okay, question.
Why is the A2 range of A2?
So,
Is that where the first part of the actual data comes?
so A2 is saying, where do I want to start writing the data out? I don't want it on A1 because because when I write the data out, it's just the data, not the headers. So I'm still writing the headers out with the same loop I had before onto row 1, and then I'm putting the data beginning in A2. All right, folks, just show me on a scale of 0 to 5 how comfortable you are with the stuff we've covered today. 4s and 5s, 3s, okay, good. All right, well then it feels like I've got you off on the right foot, because this next project, the database project, is the tough one for the semester. And we will see, and what it's about, is it about writing data into the database? And we'll take that step the next time we get together. All right, thanks for coming, class dismissed.
This Wednesday is the test review, right?
I don't know.
Yeah.
This Wednesday's test review, I better get ready for that, yeah. So we'll go over the database, the next database thing should be a week from today. That's right, what was the question? Yeah. So we will go over, so yeah, so when we get together on Wednesday, this is a MBA travel day. So normally we'd cancel class, but I'm holding the class just to review the exam. So if you have questions about which one you missed and so forth, we'll go over it then. All right, thanks for coming.